Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Let's get into the story. Richard had always considered himself a man of importance, wealthy, influential, and in complete control of everything in his life, including his marriage. To him, Deborah was nothing more than a charity case, a woman from a poor background whom he had rescued from poverty. From the very first day of their marriage, he made sure she understood that she owed him everything. He provided a lavish home, expensive clothes, and a life she could have never afforded on her own, but his generosity came at a cost, her dignity. He constantly belittled her, making her feel like she was nothing without him. His arrogance knew no bounds, and he spoke to her as if she were a servant rather than his wife. Whenever they attended social gatherings, he paraded her like a trophy, not out of love but as a reminder that she was only there because of him. Deborah, however, swallowed her pride and endured, believing that maybe, just maybe, he would one day see her as more than just an object of his possession. But beneath her silence, something was shifting. She had once been a girl who dreamed of love, but marriage to Richard had stripped her of every romantic notion. Still, she wasn't as weak as he thought. She observed everything, the way he treated her, the way he laughed at her ambitions, and how he dismissed her as if she were incapable of existing outside his world. A fire burned deep within her, waiting to be unleashed. She didn't know when or how, but she knew she wouldn't remain under his shadow forever. Richard had mistaken her silence for submission, but little did he know, his greatest mistake wasn't marrying her, it was underestimating her. Richard was a man who thrived on control. He dictated Deborah's every move, from what she wore to whom she spoke with. He had an image to uphold, and in his mind, she was just another accessory to his success. But his condescension wasn't limited to their home. In public, he never missed an opportunity to remind people of how much he had given her. At a high-profile business gala, surrounded by his colleagues, Richard chuckled as he spoke about Deborah like she was a pet he had picked up from the streets. "She was nothing before I met her," he said, sipping his whiskey. "I made her who she is today." The laughter that followed his words echoed in Deborah's ears like a slap. For the first time in years, she didn't just feel hurt, she felt rage. That night, as she lay beside him in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized she couldn't do this forever. Her life couldn't just be about enduring humiliation. She had to take control of her own destiny, whether Richard approved or not. Determined to change her fate, Deborah began taking small but significant steps. She secretly enrolled in an online business course, using the little money she had saved over the years. Every night, while Richard snored beside her, she studied, learning about investments, marketing, and financial independence. She started making connections outside his elite circle, forming friendships with people who saw her as more than just Richard's wife. Every insult he threw at her, she turned into motivation. She knew that confronting him directly would be a mistake. He thrived on belittling her. Instead, she would wait for the right moment, the perfect time to show him that she was not the helpless woman he thought she was. And when that moment came, Richard would finally realize the truth: Deborah was never his to control. Richard barely noticed the changes in Deborah. To him, she was still the same woman, quiet, obedient, and dependent on him. He was too absorbed in his own life to see the subtle shifts. She no longer waited for his approval before making decisions. She stopped seeking his attention, no longer craving his validation. She became a ghost in his world, silently weaving a future that didn't include him. She started attending networking events under the guise of charity work, meeting business-minded individuals who saw her potential. She learned from them, asked questions, and took notes. When Richard traveled for business, she used the time to grow her own knowledge, building something for herself, something he could never take credit for. But the real test came when she made her first business investment. Using her hidden savings, she partnered with a friend to start a small online fashion brand. It was a risk, but for the first time in years, she felt alive. She no longer felt like Richard's possession, she was Deborah, an independent woman with a dream. Every sale, Every profit reinvested was a step closer to her freedom. And yet, Richard remained oblivious, too secure in his belief that she would never leave him. But the truth was, Deborah wasn't just planning to leave, she was preparing to rise, stronger and more powerful than he could ever imagine. Richard had always taken Deborah's presence for granted, never imagining she could exist outside of his shadow. But for the first time, he started noticing subtle changes. She no longer jumped at his commands, nor did she wait for his permission before making decisions. Her once timid nature was fading, replaced by an air of quiet confidence that unsettled him. One evening, after returning from a business trip, he found her working on her laptop, completely engrossed. He scoffed, leaning against the doorframe. "Since when do you have things to do?" he asked, expecting her to look flustered and defensive. But instead, she barely glanced up. "Since I decided my life is worth more than waiting on you," she said simply before turning back to her screen. The response stunned him. For the first time, Richard felt something he had never associated with Deborah: power. That night, he observed her more closely. He noticed how she carried herself differently, how her phone buzzed with messages from people he had never heard of. When he demanded to know what was keeping her so busy, she merely smiled. "I'm working on something," she said vaguely. Richard didn't like the change. He had always been the one in control, and the idea that Deborah was slipping from his grasp didn't sit well with him. He resolved to remind her who she belonged to. If she thought she could have a life outside of him, she was wrong. And he was going to make sure she understood that. Richard's frustration grew as Deborah continued to evolve into someone he barely recognized. She no longer sought his approval, nor did she wait for him to acknowledge her presence. He hated it. At first, he tried to dismiss it as a phase, but the more he watched her, the more he realized she was serious. One evening, he invited some of his business associates for dinner, expecting Deborah to play the role of the doting wife. Instead, she was nowhere to be found. When she finally walked in, she was dressed elegantly, her posture commanding attention. "Where have you been?" Richard demanded, his tone sharp. She looked at him, unimpressed. "Handling my business," she replied before walking past him to greet their guests. His guests, surprised by the change in Deborah, complimented her, which only fueled Richard's irritation. That night, after the guests had left, Richard confronted her. "You're my wife," he said coldly. "Your place is by my side, not out playing businesswoman." Deborah simply smiled, unfazed by his outburst. "And yet, here I am," she said, crossing her arms. Richard clenched his jaw. This wasn't the Deborah he married. He had built her life for her, given her everything, and now she was acting as if she didn't need him. But a deeper fear began creeping into his mind: what if she truly didn't? Deborah's business venture was thriving. What had started as a small online brand was now gaining traction, attracting investors and growing beyond what she had imagined. With every success, she felt her confidence soar. She started attending high-profile business meetings, rubbing shoulders with people who saw her potential. She was no longer just Richard's wife, she was Deborah, a woman of substance. The more she grew, the less she feared Richard. His opinions no longer defined her, and his insults no longer cut deep. She had found something greater than his approval, her own self-worth. One day, while reviewing business contracts, she received a call from a well-known investor who was interested in partnering with her. The offer was lucrative, something she would have never dreamed of before. Excited, she prepared to sign the deal, but a nagging thought crept into her mind. How would Richard react when he found out? She knew he thrived on control, and the idea of her surpassing him would shatter his ego. But for the first time, she didn't care. She was done living in his shadow. That evening, she signed the deal without hesitation, marking a turning point in her life. She had officially stepped into her own power, and there was no turning back. Richard had been watching Deborah closely, and he didn't like what he saw. His once submissive wife was now a force to be reckoned with, and it infuriated him. She no longer feared him, nor did she seek his validation. It was a slap to his ego, one he wasn't willing to accept. In his mind, there was only one way to handle a woman who refused to be controlled: he would cut her off. If she thought she could stand on her own, he would prove her wrong. With a smirk, he called his lawyer and ordered him to prepare divorce papers. He was certain Deborah would break down and beg. After all, without him, she was nothing, or so he believed. When he handed her the divorce papers, he expected tears, pleading, and desperation. Instead, Deborah took the documents, glanced at them, and smiled. "Is this supposed to scare me?" she asked, looking him directly in the eye. Richard was taken aback. "You should be worried," he said, his voice laced with arrogance. "You won't survive without me." Deborah chuckled, shaking her head. "That's where you're wrong," she said, placing the papers on the table. "You see, Richard, I was already planning to leave you. You just made it easier for me." Richard's world tilted. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar: panic. Richard had expected Deborah to crumble, but instead, she flourished. The news of their impending divorce spread quickly, and to his shock, Deborah wasn't hiding in shame, she was thriving. Her business was gaining more recognition, and she was being invited to exclusive events, not as Richard's wife, but as a successful entrepreneur. It infuriated him. He had spent years keeping her in his shadow, and now she was standing in the light. He tried to sabotage her, using his connections to block her deals, but Deborah had anticipated his moves. She had built a network of allies who supported her, ensuring that Richard's influence had little effect on her success. One evening, Richard saw her on television, being interviewed as a rising businesswoman. She was poised, confident, and radiant. "Tell us, Deborah," the interviewer asked. "How does it feel to step into your own after being known as just a businessman's wife?" Deborah smiled, her eyes gleaming with determination. "It feels like I've finally become who I was meant to be," she said. Richard turned off the television, his hands clenched into fists. For the first time, he realized the truth: he hadn't abandoned Deborah. She had outgrown him. And it was the most painful realization of his life. Richard's world was spiraling. Deborah's success was growing, and his own influence was waning. Clients who once sought his approval were now approaching her for business deals. People who had once praised him were now whispering about how he had underestimated his own wife. He tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, but deep down, it did. His ego was wounded, and the more he watched Deborah rise, the more he felt like he was sinking. Desperate to regain control, he reached out to her, inviting her to dinner under the pretense of discussing their divorce settlement. But when Deborah arrived, she was not the same woman he had once dominated. She was in control now. "I don't see why we need to discuss anything," she said as she sipped her wine. "The papers are signed. We're done." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "You're really going through with this?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Deborah looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "Richard, you made me feel like I was nothing," she said. "But now, I know I'm everything you feared I could be." With that, she stood up, leaving him sitting there, drowning in the weight of his own regret. Richard sat in the restaurant long after Deborah had left, staring at the empty seat across from him. His mind refused to accept what was happening. He had always believed he held all the power in their marriage, that Deborah was nothing without him. Yet, here she was, walking away from him, stronger than ever. The whispers of people around him felt deafening, a reminder that his carefully constructed world was crumbling. When he finally left the restaurant, he drove aimlessly through the city, his thoughts in turmoil. How had he lost control? How had Deborah, the timid woman he had once dismissed, become someone he couldn't ignore? The next morning, Richard walked into his office to find his employees murmuring amongst themselves. His secretary hesitated before handing him a newspaper. Right on the front page was Deborah, smiling confidently at an exclusive business event, the headline reading, "From a businessman's wife to a business mogul, Deborah steps into her power." Richard felt rage bubble inside him. She was everywhere, her success overshadowing him. He had thought divorcing her would ruin her, but instead, she had flourished. His fingers tightened around a newspaper. He had underestimated her. And for the first time in his life, he regretted letting someone go. Richard had always prided himself on being untouchable. In his world, he was the one who made the decisions, the one people feared and respected. But ever since handing Deborah those divorce papers, he had felt something unfamiliar: loss. At first, he told himself it was anger, frustration at her disobedience, at her refusal to beg him to stay. But the more he saw her in the media, the more he heard her name spoken with admiration, the more he realized the truth. He missed her. He missed the way she used to look at him as though he were the center of her world. But most of all, he missed the power he had over her. He had thought divorcing her would break her, but instead, she had risen above him, and that was a wound his ego couldn't handle. Late at night, Richard found himself scrolling through Deborah's social media, something he had never done before. She looked different, happier, more confident. She was attending high-profile events, shaking hands with people he had spent years trying to impress. How had she come so far without him? He slammed his phone down, breathing heavily. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be the one thriving, the one moving on while she faded into obscurity. Instead, he was the one stuck in the past while she soared into the future. And for the first time, Richard found himself asking a question he had never considered before: had he made a mistake? Deborah had thought that signing the divorce papers would bring her complete freedom. And in many ways, it had. She was no longer confined to Richard's world, no longer weighed down by his expectations. She was thriving, her business expanding in ways she had never imagined. Yet, there were still moments, late at night, when the city was quiet, when she found herself thinking about him. Not because she missed him, but because she couldn't understand how she had ever allowed herself to live under his shadow for so long. Looking back, she barely recognized the woman she had been during their marriage. She had been so eager to please him, so desperate for his approval, that she had lost herself in the process. Never again, she vowed. Never again would she shrink herself for a man's comfort. One evening, as she prepared for a charity gala, she received a message from an unknown number. "I need to see you." She knew immediately who it was. Richard. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't respond. She had nothing left to say to him. As she stepped into the gala, all thoughts of Richard faded. She was greeted warmly, her presence commanding respect. This was her world now, and she refused to let the ghost of her past haunt her any longer. Richard had never experienced rejection before, and Deborah's silence was driving him mad. He had expected her to at least respond, if only to insult him. But she had done something worse: she had ignored him. It was a taste of his own medicine, and it was bitter. He had been the one who pushed her away, convinced that she was disposable. And yet, here he was, the one unable to move on. He tried to distract himself with work, with other women, but nothing filled the emptiness Deborah had left behind. His nights were restless, his mind constantly replaying their last conversation, the way she had looked at him with nothing but indifference. How had she stopped caring so easily? One evening, he attended a high-profile business event, hoping to take his mind off things. But as soon as he arrived, he realized he had made a mistake. Deborah was there. She was standing at the center of the room, laughing, her presence drawing everyone's attention. And then, to his absolute horror, he saw her with another man. The man was tall, charming, and clearly enamored with her. Richard felt a surge of jealousy so strong it nearly knocked the air out of his lungs. He had never imagined a world where Deborah would belong to someone else. But as he watched her smile at the man in a way she had never smiled at him, he realized the painful truth: he had already lost her. Richard couldn't stand it. Seeing Deborah happy, seeing her move on as though he had never mattered, was unbearable. He had convinced himself that he didn't need her, that he was better off without her. But the more he saw of her success, the more he realized that she had been the best thing in his life, and he had thrown it all away. He refused to let this be the end. He needed to talk to her, to make her see that they still had something worth saving. He tried calling her, but she didn't answer. He sent messages, each one more desperate than the last. When she continued to ignore him, he did something he had never done before: he humbled himself. One evening, he showed up at her office, unannounced. The receptionist looked surprised but didn't stop him as he walked into her office. Deborah was seated at her desk, going through documents, and when she looked up, her expression was unreadable. "Richard," she said coolly. "What are you doing here?" He took a deep breath, his arrogance nowhere to be found. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." Deborah studied him for a moment before leaning back in her chair. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with that information?" she asked. Richard had no answer. For the first time in his life, he was at someone else's mercy. And he hated it. Deborah had expected Richard to come crawling back at some point, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Looking at him now, standing in her office like a lost man, she felt nothing but a sense of justice. He had spent years belittling her, treating her as though she were nothing without him. And now, he was standing before her, admitting that he had been wrong. It was almost poetic. But she wasn't the same woman who had once sought his approval. She had grown, evolved, and she refused to let him drag her back into the past. "I don't know what you expect from me, Richard," she said, her tone firm. "But I've moved on. You should too." Richard clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to accept her words. "We were married, Deborah. That has to mean something." She shook her head. "It meant something to me once," she said. "But not anymore." Richard stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. He had thought he could walk back into her life and things would go back to the way they were. But he had underestimated her yet again. This time, there would be no second chances. Richard had always been in control of his life, his business, and most importantly, the people around him. But standing in Deborah's office, hearing her say she had moved on, shattered the last illusion he had clung to. He wanted to argue, to remind her of the life they had built together, but deep down, he knew the truth. That life had been built on his arrogance, his belief that she would never leave. He had taken her for granted, and now, he was paying the price. Deborah's expression was calm, but there was a steeliness in her gaze that told him she was serious. She wasn't playing a game. She was done. For the first time, Richard felt the full weight of his mistakes. He had lost her, not because she had changed, but because he had refused to. "I just thought," he swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "I thought you would still care." Deborah sighed, standing up from her chair. "I do care, Richard," she said, but her voice lacked the warmth it once held. "Just not in the way you want me to." Those words felt like a final nail in the coffin of their relationship. As he turned to leave, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one walking away. Days turned into weeks, and Richard found himself haunted by memories of Deborah. Everywhere he went, something reminded him of her: the scent of her favorite perfume lingering on an old suit, the empty side of the bed that once belonged to her, the silence in the house that used to be filled with her presence. He had always believed that he could replace anything in his life: employees, women, even love. But Deborah had proven him wrong. There was no replacing her. She had been the one constant in his life, the person who had truly cared for him despite his flaws. And he had pushed her away. One evening, he found himself driving past her new office, staring at the tall building with her name boldly displayed on the front. She had built something incredible, something that no longer had anything to do with him. He had expected her to struggle without him, but instead, she had thrived. It was a painful realization. He had never made her successful. She had always had that strength within her. He had just been too blind to see it. For the first time, Richard wondered if he had truly been the powerful one in their marriage, or if it had always been Deborah holding everything together. And now, without her, he was nothing. Deborah sat in her office, flipping through a stack of documents, but her mind was elsewhere. Ever since Richard had shown up at her office weeks ago, a small part of her had wondered if he had truly changed. Not because she wanted him back, no, that part of her life was over, but because she had once loved him, and she hoped he could learn from his mistakes. She had spent years allowing his words to define her, his arrogance to shape her self-worth. But now, she saw things clearly. Richard had never been the man she thought he was. And she would never allow herself to be that woman again. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Daniel, the man she had been seeing for a few months now. He was kind, attentive, and, most importantly, he treated her with the respect she had never received from Richard. She smiled as she read his message, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. She had once believed that love had to be painful, that it required suffering and endurance. But now, she knew better. Love was not about power or control. It was about mutual respect and happiness. And for the first time in a long time, Deborah was truly happy. Richard sat in his massive penthouse, staring out at the city skyline. The life he had once built for himself felt hollow now. He had wealth, success, and power, but none of it brought him the satisfaction it once did. He had always prided himself on being the man everyone feared and admired. But what was the point of power if there was no one to share it with? His friends still surrounded him, but he realized now that they were nothing more than acquaintances, people who stayed close because of what he could offer them. They didn't truly care about him. And the one person who had cared, Deborah, was gone. He thought about reaching out to her again, but what would he say? That he had changed? That he regretted everything? He knew it wouldn't matter. Deborah had moved on, and she deserved her happiness. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. He had spent years believing that love was weakness, that showing emotions made a man vulnerable. But now, he saw the truth. Love wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that truly mattered. And he had thrown it away. For the first time in his life, Richard felt completely and utterly alone. Deborah walked through the doors of her new home, taking in the space she had created for herself. It was nothing like the cold, lifeless mansion she had once shared with Richard. This place was warm, filled with light and laughter. It reflected who she had become, a woman who had reclaimed her life on her own terms. As she set down her bags, Daniel appeared from the kitchen, a glass of wine in hand. "Busy day?" he asked, smiling. She nodded, taking the glass from him. "A good kind of busy," she said. She had worked hard to get to this point, to build a life that was hers alone. And she had no regrets. As she sat beside Daniel, she realized how far she had come. She had once been a woman who believed she needed to earn love, to fight for the affection of a man who never truly valued her. But now, she understood her worth. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She was enough, just as she was. Richard had expected her to beg when he served her those divorce papers. Instead, she had walked away, and in doing so, she had found herself. Smiling, she raised her glass in a silent toast to the future. The past was behind her. And the best was yet to come. Richard had always prided himself on being a man who never dwelled on the past. His philosophy was simple: if something wasn't working, discard it and move on. But Deborah was different. No matter how hard he tried to push her from his mind, she lingered like an unfinished chapter in his life. He found himself revisiting old photos, staring at the memories they once shared. It was strange, he had spent so much time controlling her, molding her into the perfect wife, yet the woman she had become after leaving him was far more remarkable than he had ever allowed her to be. One evening, after a long, exhausting day at work, he found himself parked outside Deborah's new home. He wasn't sure why he had come, maybe out of curiosity, or maybe because he needed to see her one last time. From his car, he could see her through the window, laughing as she set the table for dinner. And then, he saw him, Daniel. The man who had taken his place. A sharp pain twisted in Richard's chest as he watched them together, their body language so natural, so intimate. This was what happiness looked like. And for the first time, Richard understood, Deborah had never been the one who needed him. He had been the one who needed her. Deborah had spent years walking on eggshells around Richard, carefully choosing her words, her actions, even her thoughts, just to keep the peace. But with Daniel, things were different. She was free. Free to laugh, free to speak, free to be herself without fear of judgment. She no longer felt like an accessory to someone else's life, she was living her own. The success of her business had brought her financial independence, but more importantly, it had given her confidence. She no longer doubted her worth, no longer questioned whether she was enough. She was more than enough. One evening, as she and Daniel walked along the beach, she finally let herself reflect on the past. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked, sensing the thoughts swirling in her mind. Deborah smiled, shaking her head. "No," she said. "I don't regret the experience. It taught me what I will and will not accept. It taught me to stand up for myself." Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "And now?" he asked. She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Now, I'm exactly where I want to be." For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The past no longer had power over her. She had rewritten her own story. Richard was not a man who admitted defeat easily, but losing Deborah had shaken something inside him. He found himself reflecting on his past actions, questioning everything he had once believed. His arrogance had cost him the only person who had ever truly loved him, and now, he was left with nothing but regret. For the first time in his life, he wondered if he was the problem. He had always thought strength meant dominance, that love was about control. But Deborah had proven him wrong. True strength was knowing when to let go. He knew he couldn't win her back, he had lost that chance. But maybe, just maybe, he could become a better man. Not for her, but for himself. He started attending therapy, confronting the demons he had long ignored. It was uncomfortable, painful even, but necessary. He began treating his employees with respect, learning to listen rather than dictate. Slowly, he was changing. And though Deborah would never know it, she had been the catalyst. She had left him, but in doing so, she had given him the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to become someone worthy of love. Deborah's relationship with Daniel had blossomed into something she never thought possible, pure, uncomplicated love. There were no power struggles, no belittling remarks, no emotional exhaustion. With Daniel, love felt easy. She didn't have to prove herself or shrink to fit into someone else's expectations. She was cherished exactly as she was. They spent their days building dreams together, supporting each other's ambitions, and enjoying the little moments, sunset walks, long conversations, laughter over shared meals. It was the kind of love she had once thought only existed in fairy tales. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, Daniel reached into his pocket, his expression turning serious. "Deborah," he said softly, "I love you. I have loved you from the moment I met you. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much." He opened a small velvet box, revealing a ring that sparkled under the moonlight. Deborah felt a lump rise in her throat. This was everything she had ever wanted, not the ring, not the grand gesture, but the sincerity, the respect, the genuine love behind it. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Yes." This time, she was marrying for love, not survival. The wedding was nothing like the extravagant, soulless ceremony she had shared with Richard. This one was intimate, filled with genuine laughter and the warmth of people who truly loved her. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, one that reflected the woman she had become, strong, confident, and free. As she walked down the aisle, she felt no fear, no doubt, only certainty. This was where she was meant to be. Daniel stood at the altar, his eyes filled with admiration. "I promise to honor you, to respect you, and to love you with everything I have," he vowed, his voice steady. Deborah smiled, feeling the weight of her past finally lift. She had once been a woman who believed love required suffering, that marriage was about endurance. But now, she understood. Love was not meant to break you, it was meant to build you. As they exchanged rings, she knew one thing for certain: this was not just a wedding. It was a celebration of the woman she had become. And this time, she was choosing love on her own terms. A month after their wedding, Deborah and Daniel were enjoying their honeymoon in Cape Town when fate decided to test her growth. As they strolled through a luxury hotel lobby, laughter and soft music filling the air, Deborah froze. Just a few feet away stood Richard. He looked different, less arrogant, more subdued. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around her blurred. She wasn't sure if it was anger, pity, or indifference that surged through her, but she knew one thing: she no longer feared him. Richard approached cautiously, his usual commanding presence replaced with something unfamiliar: humility. "Deborah," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "You look happy." She nodded, gripping Daniel's hand tighter. "I am." There was no need for revenge, no desire to prove anything. She had already won by moving on. Richard hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to say I was wrong. About everything." His gaze flickered to Daniel before returning to her. "You deserved better, and I hope you found it." Deborah searched his face, looking for manipulation, but found none. Just a man who had finally realized the weight of his own mistakes. And for the first time, she felt no resentment, only closure. Deborah had spent years thinking that Richard owed her an apology, that she needed to hear him admit his faults for her to truly heal. But standing there, looking at the man who once controlled her world, she realized something: she had healed without it. His apology was merely an afterthought, an unnecessary punctuation mark at the end of a chapter she had already closed. Smiling softly, she nodded. "Thank you, Richard. I hope you find your own happiness." With that, she turned away, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind her. Daniel squeezed her hand as they walked out of the hotel. "Are you okay?" he asked, searching her face. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter than ever. "I'm more than okay," she said with a smile. "I finally understand that my happiness was never tied to his regret. It was always within me." That night, as she lay beside Daniel, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She had not only survived Richard's cruelty, but she had risen above it, proving that true strength wasn't about fighting battles, it was about knowing when to walk away. With her past finally behind her, Deborah embraced the future with open arms. Her business flourished beyond her wildest dreams, growing into one of the most sought-after fashion brands in the country. Investors lined up, magazines featured her, and the same society that once dismissed her now admired her resilience. But success didn't change her. It simply amplified the woman she had always been: graceful, kind, and determined. One evening, as she sat in her office, reflecting on how far she had come, a young woman nervously knocked on her door. "Mrs. Deborah, one just wanted to say you inspire me. I used to think women like me could never make it. But seeing you prove everyone wrong gives me hope." Deborah smiled warmly, seeing her old self reflected in the young woman's eyes. "Never let anyone tell you your worth," she said firmly. "You define that yourself." As the woman left, Deborah exhaled deeply. She had once sought validation from a man who belittled her, but now, She was the one inspiring others. She had truly become the woman she was always meant to be. Life had a funny way of working out, Deborah realized. There was a time she thought love meant enduring pain, that marriage was a contract rather than a partnership. But with Daniel, she had found something deeper, a love built on respect, trust, and friendship. They spent their days traveling, supporting each other's dreams, and most importantly, growing together. Deborah no longer lived in fear of disappointing anyone because she had finally learned to prioritize herself. One evening, as they sat on their balcony, watching the stars, Daniel wrapped his arms around her. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice filled with warmth. She smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am. For everything. Even the painful parts," she admitted. "Because they led me here." Daniel kissed her forehead. "You deserve this happiness, Deborah. And I promise, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that." Tears welled in her eyes, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. She had spent years questioning her worth, but now, she knew, she was priceless. Deborah stood on the balcony of her beautiful home, the soft evening breeze brushing against her skin. She had come a long way from the timid girl who once cowered under Richard's control. Now, she was a woman who owned her life, her choices, and her happiness. She had built something for herself, not just a business, not just a new love, but a legacy of resilience and strength. She was proof that no woman needed to stay in a place where she was unappreciated. As Daniel joined her, placing a protective hand on her growing belly, she smiled. She was going to be a mother, a role she once feared she wasn't strong enough to handle. But now, she knew better. She would raise her child in love, in freedom, in a home where they would never doubt their worth. And as she looked out at the horizon, she whispered softly, "I won." Not against Richard, not against society, but against the fears and doubts that had once held her captive. She had won the greatest battle of all, the battle for herself. And this was only the beginning. Deborah stood on the balcony of her penthouse, gazing out at the glittering city skyline. It was hard to believe how much her life had changed. Only a few years ago, she had been a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, walking on eggshells around a man who never saw her worth. Now, she was free, successful, and most importantly, happy. She rested a hand on her growing belly, feeling the tiny flutter of life within her. Pregnancy had been both a surprise and a blessing, a new chapter she never thought she would experience again after everything she had endured. She had spent years rebuilding herself, proving to the world and to herself that she was more than the timid wife Richard had once dismissed. Her business empire had flourished, expanding beyond what she had ever envisioned. People now looked up to her, respected her. But despite all this success, what truly mattered to her now was family. Daniel, the man who had loved her without conditions, had been her rock through every step of this journey. "You're going to be an amazing mother," he whispered as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. Deborah closed her eyes, leaning into his warmth. "And you," she murmured, "will be the best father." Pregnancy had forced Deborah to slow down, something she wasn't used to. She was a woman who thrived on movement, on pushing forward, on proving herself. But now, her body demanded rest. The exhaustion was unlike anything she had ever known. Some days, she felt invincible, ready to take on the world. Other days, she struggled to even get out of bed. Daniel had taken it upon himself to ensure she didn't overwork herself, constantly reminding her that she didn't have to do everything alone. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery they had carefully designed, Deborah felt a wave of emotions she hadn't expected. "I want her to know she is enough," she whispered, running her fingers over the soft fabric of the baby clothes neatly folded in the drawer. "I want her to grow up knowing she doesn't have to fight for love." Daniel took her hand, his eyes filled with warmth. "She will. Because she has you as her mother." Tears welled in Deborah's eyes. For so long, she had lived in fear of being unworthy, of being unwanted. Now, she realized, she was loved, deeply and truly. And soon, she would have the chance to pass that love on to her daughter. One afternoon, as Deborah was sorting through documents in her office, her secretary entered with an envelope. "This came for you," she said hesitantly. The handwriting on the envelope was immediately familiar, Richard. Deborah's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. She hadn't thought about him in a long time. He had become a distant memory, a lesson from the past. But as she read the words on the page, she felt a wave of emotions she couldn't quite name. Richard was facing financial ruin. His reckless decisions, his arrogance, had finally caught up with him. He had lost everything: the company, the wealth, even the admiration of the people who once surrounded him. But what struck Deborah the most was his apology. He admitted he had been wrong, that he had been blind to what he had. He didn't ask for money or pity, just a chance to tell her he regretted everything. Deborah exhaled slowly, folding the letter. Once, she might have longed for this moment, might have thought his regret would give her closure. But now, she realized, she didn't need his apology to move on. She had already won by choosing herself. The night Deborah went into labor, a storm raged outside. The contractions were unbearable, each one stronger than the last. Daniel drove as fast as he could through the pouring rain, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Breathe, love," he kept saying, his voice filled with both reassurance and panic. But Deborah barely heard him. She was focused on one thing only: bringing their child into the world. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity of pain and exhaustion, a sharp cry filled the hospital room. Deborah's breath hitched as the doctor placed a tiny, wriggling baby in her arms. Tears blurred her vision as she looked at her daughter for the first time. "She's perfect," she whispered, overwhelmed by love so fierce it stole her breath. Daniel kissed her forehead, his eyes wet with emotion. "You did it," he murmured. Deborah held her baby close, pressing a trembling kiss to her soft forehead. In that moment, everything, the pain, the past, the struggles, melted away. She had fought through so much, and now, she had been given the greatest gift of all. Motherhood was more challenging than Deborah had ever imagined. The sleepless nights, the endless feedings, the overwhelming responsibility of nurturing a life, it was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Despite all her successes, nothing had prepared her for the sheer exhaustion and self-doubt that came with being a new mother. Was she doing enough? Was she making the right choices? Daniel was her anchor, always there to remind her that she didn't have to be perfect. "She doesn't need a perfect mother," he told her one night as she sat beside the crib, watching Amelia sleep. "She just needs you." Deborah wiped away a tear, leaning into him. Slowly, she learned to trust herself, to embrace the imperfections of motherhood. She realized that love, more than perfection, was what truly mattered. And as she watched her daughter grow, she promised herself that she would always be there, not just as a mother, but as a woman who had fought for her happiness and won. Unlike her first marriage, Deborah's love with Daniel grew stronger with time. They made conscious efforts to nurture their relationship, knowing that love needed care to flourish. They scheduled date nights, went on spontaneous trips, and never stopped communicating. Daniel remained her biggest cheerleader, encouraging her to pursue her dreams while also reminding her to make time for herself. One evening, as they sat on their balcony, watching the sunset, Deborah turned to Daniel with tears in her eyes. "I never thought I could have this," she admitted. "A love that doesn't hurt." Daniel cupped her face, his gaze steady. "Because real love doesn't break you, Deborah. It builds you." And in that moment, she knew, she had finally found the life she had always deserved. Deborah's journey wasn't just about her anymore. She had built a thriving business, but she wanted to use her influence for something greater. She launched initiatives to support women, helping those trapped in toxic relationships and offering career opportunities to those who needed a fresh start. At a conference, she shared her story, the pain, the growth, the triumph. As she spoke, She saw women in the audience wiping their tears, seeing themselves in her journey. That night, she realized that her purpose was greater than personal success. She was a voice for the voiceless, proof that no woman had to stay where she wasn't valued. Years had passed, and Deborah had almost forgotten about Richard, until he showed up at one of her charity events. He looked different, aged, humbled. "You really built something incredible," he said, his voice laced with regret. Deborah smiled. "I did," she replied. "And I did it without you." Seeing Richard again didn't shake Deborah. It only reaffirmed that she had made the right choices. She had once thought she needed his validation, but now, she knew better. As she walked away from him for the last time, she felt nothing but peace. Deborah sat on her balcony, Amelia playing nearby, Daniel's arms wrapped around her. She had come so far, from a woman who was once broken to one who had built an extraordinary life. She smiled, whispering to herself, "I won." Not against Richard, but against her own doubts. And that was the greatest victory of all. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.